Good evening from South Africa and from my home, and a huge thank you for taking the time to visit here with me today, and thank you to the RPA for giving me the opportunity to speak to you about something so important. There's a whole lot of information here, so I decided to give you as much information as possible as opposed to actually less. So this is me, Suzanne Ravenel. I'm a transformational coach, and I combine coaching, hypnotherapy, energy clearing, resonance repatterning, and human performance science to service different clients at both a group and individual level. I have a really deep passion for human performance science and also for those very special clients that have been caught up with trauma. So this is not about me today, so let's get moving. Today is all about what I call bounce. So what is this bounce? It's about bouncing back from trauma and toxic stress, bouncing into new beginnings, into a brand new healthy lifestyle. So for the next hour, join me in what I call trauma-informed bouncing. Trauma is such a topic that people like to stay away from generally, but I've found that the more people know what's going on inside of them, it changes their perspective on the outside really, really quickly. So to help them, I found that actually we have to become a bit like a mini Sherlock Holmes. Investigation really is the key. Although I do think that when I was a kid, I secretly wanted to be Sherlock Holmes. So I've now grown up. Here we are doing something very similar. How funny is that? Although actually I say I'm grown up, but on the outside for sure. So trauma is a massive subject. I know that. So I've actually allocated a handout with a lot more detail in it, with the presentation, which you can obtain from the RPA website. So we're going to go down a journey today on a brief overview of trauma, the workings of the nervous system, the brain's involvement in trauma, and how to spot it. And there are so many kinds, but today we've got a light focus on early development trauma, a quick nugget on intergenerational trauma, how to care for yourself and the client, and how to go from dysregulation to regulation. Now, if you've joined the conference today with an objective or hope of perhaps expanding your practice, dealing with these special clients can be really, really fulfilling. And perhaps this may, during the course of this presentation, perhaps open some thoughts on adding other areas such as maybe coaching or somatic practice to resonance repatterning. So keep this in mind as you go. A quick disclaimer before we start. It's obviously important to confirm when you're dealing with trauma what the client needs are so that you can service them within the scope of your practice. You need to consult or refer to a specialist or specialists when dealing with complex trauma, particularly if on the ACE scale they are 4 or over. If you're not familiar with ACE, we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. This presentation contains information that I've learned through my own trauma journey and the work and information that I use with my clients, and also that which I've gleaned from amazing people over time. Lastly, one of the considerations is the regulations and insurance that's applicable for the countries that you work in. As I mentioned, I work with clients in many, many countries across the world. And for sure, in each one of those countries, the insurance coverage is different in all those places. So it's really important that you check what you can and what you can't do with each one of those countries. Okay, so as we start today, I would just like you to consider a couple of things. When we talk about trauma, our nervous system really, really wakes up and listens. It may have its own reaction to what you're actually seeing and hearing today, or perhaps maybe it might recognize something that feels a little bit familiar from a past experience. If that happens, it's really important that you take a second to just check in with yourself and take any action that you need. If you find yourself getting a little bit anxious, maybe defensive or even irritated, have some water that will help dilute the cortisol and stress hormones, or have some protein nearby that can absorb both the chemicals and hormones. Or what you can do is just take the 2 fingers of each hand and put them either side of your leg and tap left and tap right at whatever pace feels comfortable, and do that a few times. It's not EFT tapping, it's balancing your nervous system by getting the attention to go back and forth from the cognitive side of the brain to the emotional side. It will really prevent either one from taking over. It will help balance any fear that may arise. Okay, so a little bit about my story. how did I end up talking about this topic? In my early years, I began a journey of early childhood development trauma at the in utero and sensory stage, which was then followed by emotional, mental, and sexual abuse. And this set up a whole stream of abusive, non-coherent relationships, repeated assaults, and a lack of understanding as to how coherent life and relationships actually really worked. And this is what I unfortunately came to know in the beginning as my normal life, a constant life of toxic stress and trying to rescue others from it, people pleasing and seeking love from those who actually harmed me. This, coupled with a stroke, brain damage, chronic stress, PTSD, immune system issues, and a whole multitude of other health issues, I reached out for help as a child and was rejected. And this left me thinking, it has to be me. There must be something wrong with me, that somehow I am completely unlovable and unworthy. So what did I do? I buried my own trauma. Because in the first instance, I had no idea that this was actually out of the norm, as crazy as that actually sounds. So I normalized it in my mind and normalized it in my life. And then I carried on. And unfortunately, this is an oh so very familiar story for people that have suffered trauma. I left home when I was 16, 17. I just knew that I needed to embark on a journey which culminated in years of study, which I might add, I'm still on this unfolding path, a path of growth, but also a study on toxic stress and trauma. So by the time we get to our 30s, memorized behaviors, emotions, and attitudes function just like a computer program. The person and the body have actually become the mind of that state of being. Habits that are now a set of non-coherent thoughts, beliefs, and responses which have become patterns of behavior, which occurred through a cycle of frequent, and this is very important, unknowing repetition. So to get out of it, we must first of all recognize what is going on in our system. And I talk about that a lot today in terms of education. We really must start to notice the non-coherent thoughts, beliefs, and patterns, and then recondition the body to create a brand new mind, a new familiar. We're training our bodies and minds to go from an old familiar set of patterns, dysregulation, to a new familiar set of patterns, regulatory patterns. So if we think of our body as part of our supercomputer, what we need is to upgrade that software. And if we keep thinking and feeling in the same way with the old software program, the body just runs the show. And it knows how to do it way better than our conscious mind. Like any computer, the software really needs to be updated. And this is really what we're going to be talking about today. It was a massive wake-up call for me when I realized all of a sudden that all these other people living on the planet actually were not living on the same paradigm as me, that their lives were different, and somehow my computer program was not the same, that I'd somehow obtained a different one or a virus that needed remedying. The journey to heal from any sort of trauma is really a courageous one, but not just a courageous one for the person that has been through the trauma, for the person that actually is willing to help the individuals that have gone through this process. And it really can't be taken lightly or without thought and care for not just the client, but also the practitioner. So the first part of my share today with you is information. It's about being trauma informed. What happens to the client when they are traumatized? This is the critical first part of the journey of their trauma recovery and the regulation of the nervous system from one place to another. The client really must be educated and remember that our nervous system is listening all the time. So today, trauma shows up most often as the primary cause in clients who've literally thrown everything at their health to get well and seemingly just can't get better. And I'm sure in your practice, you've had very, very many of those. In a lot of cases, it seems that almost overnight, the client went from what they termed as feeling really well to a whole bunch of health problems that just seems to be one thing after the other. And that additional toxic stress then adds to the trauma. So when we talk about toxic stress, what are we really talking about? Trauma is toxic stress. We're talking about those toxic chemicals like toxic cortisol coursing through our bodies from high stress and trauma, cutting out some of those brain receptors and weakening the hippocampus, making it really difficult to both turn off and regulate our nervous system, causing a constant state of alert and often hypervigilance, and potentially an entire system that seems just out of control, tired and wired, and just constantly hijacked. Sadly, because there are so many psychological and physical consequences from trauma, what does actually get turned on are 30 different kinds of diseases, and you can see them here on this slide. Diseases like cancer from inflammation, multiple sclerosis, gut problems, ADHD, Alzheimer's, stroke, heart disease, and so on. They're all listed, as I said, on this slide. There are so many. During my own process, I was diagnosed with or had problems with 12 of these on this slide. And this just adds, as I said, more stress to the original trauma. Low cortisol as well can be equally as dangerous. The loss of cortisol receptors means the person is not able to cope well with stress. So any new threat means they go from 0 to 60 miles an hour, super, super fast. And it takes longer then to reabsorb the cortisol and much longer to calm down, which can then lead to complex and post-traumatic stress disorder. So to put it into context, how strong these chemicals really are, the way that I like to think about it is this: when you break a bone or have a severe shock, you get this whole rush of chemicals into our system from our brilliant autonomic nervous system that actually slows down the blood and the heart rate to protect us. It's like someone's actually injected us with a massive dose of anesthetic. Or perhaps if you've ever been to the dentist and had happy gas, it also feels a bit like that. But when we're suffering with toxic stress, we don't necessarily feel the opposing toxic chemicals because we're just so used to them. They've simply become just so familiar. A trauma experience indeed changes the way that people understand themselves. It also changes their relationship with the world as well as their brains. But when we know how to spot it, we become trauma informed. Then there's a treatment plan that can change lives really, really rapidly. So part of this trauma information is taking a quick look at some statistics. It's really important information to help the client know that they're not alone. There are a lot more people in the world than they thought that actually have gone through some kind of trauma. The startling trauma numbers also immediately show the chances that every practitioner is dealing with clients who are actually traumatized without them communicating it or without the practitioner knowing is really, really high. So perhaps you or some of your clients may be frustrated that the results are just not happening as fast as they would like to. And the reason most often is actually trauma sequencing or education. In a global survey across the general population of 24 different countries, it showed that 70% of people had suffered at least one traumatic event, and nearly 31% went on to experience 4 or more. The National Council reported similar numbers just for the USA. 70% of its citizens had experienced trauma, 30% went on to experience PTSD. A woman's beaten every 15 seconds in domestic violence, 33% of youths experienced community violence, and within the public health environment in the US, over 90% had experienced trauma. For every soldier who serves in a war zone from the US, there are 10 children unsafe in their homes. In South Africa, a child is raped every 3 minutes. 40% of South African women are raped, 1 in 9 rapes are reported, and only 14% of the perpetrators are jailed. These are just crazy, crazy facts and numbers. But the studies continue to show exactly the same findings for multiple countries all over the world, doesn't matter where they are. So what does this actually tell us? This is not a country, class, or part of society problem. It's a massive global human problem perpetrated by a complete lack of understanding as to how we are changing our society by not dealing with its root cause. In 1985, a man by the name of Vincent was running a weight loss program, and he noticed that people making progress were just dropping out, and he couldn't understand it. Why would they stop doing something that was actually helping them? So he began to start interviewing them and found almost every second person had survived some form of sexual abuse, often at the hands of a family member. Since this very first study, there have been over 70 published papers that now show that the more adverse childhood experiences, which is called ACE for short, are not only directly linked to, but now can actually predict the adult's future health. Through these studies that have been done, it shows that ACEs, the more ACEs a person has, they are indeed at a higher risk for physical disease, chronic and mental illness, heart disease, being a victim of violence, or being the one that is violent. They are the high costs in healthcare, mental health, and criminal justice systems, and the majority of the mental, chronic, economic, and social health issues. I'm not sharing this information to shock you, although I realize that indeed some of these statistics are very shocking. It's just really important to be informed. However, out of this, there is a bit of good news. Finally, it's becoming more widely known in the medical fraternity that trauma and toxic stress combined with this nervous system dysregulation underlies a majority of the chronic issues. So trauma-informed practitioners and therapists are about to become in really, really high demand. What's also really clear from this research is that a mother who is depressed or has a nervous breakdown, for instance, and is maybe unable to attune to her child in their early childhood, it's also considered a score on the ACE scale. And this counts as being just as predictable for adult disease as having been physically or sexually abused. So this tells us that our body and its survival mechanisms actually don't know the difference between living with a normal, available, shut down parent or actually being physically abused. But what the body does know is toxic stress and danger. So if the child had a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, and at that time they weren't brought back to what's called the baseline of a healthy nervous system, they are in all likelihood still suffering. And here's the kicker, most unknowingly. So what is actually just trauma then? So let's define it. Of course, we're focused on the lower three chakras, and I saw some beautiful work that's being done by the RPA on this conference to help with healing that. It's all about our survival in the world. So most people think that trauma actually means only the extremes of violence or abuse, but trauma is not defined by the actual event, but by the activation of our primary survival responses from our autonomic nervous system to what actually seems to be a real or perceived threat. And then it shows up as a body-based response. So the experiences we hold are unique and different from each other. And none of us can actually determine what will be traumatic or the degree it will be traumatic for another person. So it's why the understanding of trauma is absolutely critical. I can count so many instances where someone had behaved so non-coherently towards me, and after they'd finished in response to a question, from them my answer was, I feel traumatized. And as a non-trauma informed person, their response was, you need help. That can't be. A laugh because they thought I was joking. I can also count though as many times where I behaved non-coherently at that same time or different times without the right knowledge and must have actually traumatized the other. It certainly really, really does make us a hell of a lot more aware of how we put ourselves out there in the world. There are so many people that actually have been traumatized. Friends and family can also unwittingly trigger past events by poking fun, joking, non-coherent behaviors, or by just forgetting to respond to messages or emails. Such simple things can trigger old pathways. Family and friends can also be the worst at their responses and make matters more traumatic. So here's some of the things that I've heard over time. What on earth did you do to attract that to you? That came from a professional coach. There's something wrong with you. That came from a parent. Why on earth did you stay with him if you were being abused? That was a friend. So as shocking as these are, discernment is definitely a key for the traumatized person. Learning discernment of who to trust, with what, and then what you share with whom. And this is a learning session all on its own. Something that I like to call compartmentalizing and learning to put people into boxes can be a really, really nice exercise to do. Once listing all of the friends and business colleagues as an example on pieces of cut up paper and then moving them into never thought about before boxes. Perhaps the friend that you go to the movies with is a person you enjoy just for the movies, but it's not the person that you would trust with your health problems. So once these people have been compartmentalized in relation to who they are to you and then how you relate to them during the learning process, discernment becomes really much easier to do. And what's interesting with that process, often those people get compartmentalized again after reviewing them and moving them into different boxes. And that's just, again, growth for the client. Sadly, the traumatized client, as I mentioned earlier, often decides not to share the trauma as they are just too fearful to disclose. And they don't even know that they've actually been traumatized. And they don't even know that they're carrying trauma as the root cause of a set of perhaps non-coherent behaviors or illnesses. They might believe that an incident that happened is actually their fault, which is often perpetuated by all of those people around them, particularly family. They continually repeat that narrative and often convince themselves then that they're making a big deal out of it, perhaps thinking it happened to everyone when they were a child. It's just emotional abuse. I was shouted at, put down, or made to feel worthless, or something more serious as being molested or sexual assault. Once that trauma is anchored in and goes unchecked, it perpetuates a cycle of continuous events and relationships of a similar nature. Mostly the traumatized client continues to be surrounded by some of the same people that traumatized them or similar people to them. They surround themselves with people like themselves, as they don't trust anyone who doesn't look or act like them. And they just can't see that that's a problem. Anything outside of this feels completely unfamiliar, unrecognizable, and strange. So they discount these good people unknowingly. They're often alone without a close support network. And if they are surrounded by people, the network tends to be shallow with little or no depth. And they're just surrounded by the same, perhaps, trauma sufferers. The tragic lives of people that have been sucked into a life of ownership by pimps, broken or abusive relationships, drugs, alcohol abuse, gang violence. The chances that trauma is underlying each of these causes and probably mostly unknown to them, and I think is probably equal to 100%. So here's a question for you to consider. How many people are actually working in companies suffering with trauma and are not delivering, or how many are suffering with trauma that are in key or elevated positions and they don't know it? And what if this could be resolved? What would actually happen to their performance? We as human beings are designed to heal and thrive. And when we live without untreated trauma, we end up in a life of survival, and it just breaks down our mind and our bodies. Stephen Porges' scientific research on the vagus nerve polyvagal theory also helps us understand what must be in place to actually be the healthy human. There are many, many different types of trauma, which can be summarized generally into 4 categories. But for today's purpose, I've actually detailed them here. We could add many more, and most are self-explanatory, so I won't go through them all, and you can actually see them on the slide in front of you. But I will do is pull up a couple of just interesting things. So you can see from the slide shock, you can see there that over the age of 5, verbal abuse equals shock to a client. Accumulated stress, living in industrial cultures, the work environment, not enough downtime, not enough sleep, are all examples of accumulated stress that can again lead to trauma. In terms of medical, all the obvious things that we would know, but what's interesting here is routine doctor's appointment and poor bedside manner can also lead to feelings of trauma. Bullying, sexual abuse, community violence, which also includes gang violence, complex trauma, and complex trauma describes exposure to multiple traumatic events as opposed to one single event. And it's often invasive and also of an interpersonal nature. Disasters, intimate partner violence, physical abuse, refugee trauma, terrorism and violence, traumatic grief, intergenerational trauma, early development trauma. There is so many, and we're going to have a little focus on the early development trauma and intergenerational trauma today. So now we know there are different variations. Now we're going to turn our attention to the power of the nervous system. So I want you just to take a second for yourself. There's a lot of information. Just to take a big breath. Just take a minute and have a breath as we go through the process. Okay. So now we're going to have a look at the power of our nervous system, and also we're going to look at the role in it keeping us well and safe, because it's absolutely critical. The nervous system, which you can see here, gets turned on automatically, which is why it's called the autonomic nervous system. On the one side, the autonomic nervous system runs on autopilot and manages key bodily functions for us, like digestive system, our heart rate, eliminating fluids, expelling what's not needed. And this very same system, though, that helps us breathe and digest, when faced with threatening events, automatically defaults into survival mode. And it does this in an attempt to get us to fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, the 4 Fs as I call it. Fawning, if this is a new term for you, is codependence or people pleasing. It's about getting closer to people who actually hurt them so that they can be hurt less. Fawn is the least known, but potentially the most pervasive and dangerous, and it's linked directly to the individual's survival. We have 2 parts of our autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic nervous system, called the SNS, and the parasympathetic, called the PNS. And these parts work together behind the scenes to control the same group of body functions that help keep us alive. But they have opposing effects on the functions that they regulate. The SNS prepares the body for activity and is the root of the fight and flight response. And it's activated way faster than the PNS. The PNS purpose is to conserve our energy. It wants us to rest and to digest properly. The PNS is the body's baseline, the baseline which we come down to after we've actually been activated. The best way to understand this entire cycle is with Peter Levine's discovery in the late 60s that animals just simply don't get PTSD in stressful situations, but of course humans do. So I want you to imagine now a springbok, not the South African rugby team, the springbok on the picture here, and imagine this springbok being chased by the leopard that you also see. As soon as this happens, the springbok goes immediately into survival mode and into flight, and she runs and runs and runs, trying to escape and protect herself. This flight reaction is the autonomic nervous system turned on to the absolute max. The more primitive parts of the springbok's brain has taken over and starts a chain of chemical reactions to optimize her chances of getting away. So if the springbok actually gets away, its nervous system will then calm down from the chase and will just deactivate. And the brain then returns to the normal evolved parts and, of course, the baseline. The springbok goes back to its normal functioning, like grazing, normal physiology. However, if the springbok is caught by the leopard, it now senses that potentially I might be dinner. And then it goes immediately into a freeze reaction to numb out the pain of being killed. The springbok might look dead, but in reality, it's just a shutdown response. If the leopard, though, gets distracted, the springbok senses that there might be another chance that she can save her life. She gets up and flees again, back into flight mode from freeze, and runs for safety. And when the springbok stops and is now safe, she shakes or rolls so that she can self-soothe and let go of the trauma. And that is what we don't do as humans. We mostly hold on because of our social conditions and higher brain functioning, and we just don't know we're doing it. So if there was a series of really scary situations, and at the time the caregiver or you had no idea how to go about soothing and bringing your system down from an activated or dysregulated state back to a regulated state, then your body would stay, of course, in this very same activated response, waiting to be healed, even if the frightening experience was over. It's a bit like someone throwing a frisbee at you and you seeing it coming out the corner of your eye, but you don't get there quick enough and it bangs you on the head. And so your shoulders are still doing this for the rest of your life unless you actually came down from the unregulated or dysregulated state. So add to this a series of traumas or stresses coupled with the negative emotions as we get older in our normal everyday life. For example, things like paying debts or work stresses or family stress. It can take just one tiny little thing, like maybe a bad word or an argument with a parent or a spouse, for example, to actually just tip that balance. And then all of a sudden the cup is full. And before you know it, the system has turned into a brewing tsunami with energy and power just building up and actually just waiting to be released. But the tsunami hasn't just arrived yet. So the fight, flight, survival response can only stay on for so long. And then what happens is freeze takes over. So I want you to imagine a car for a moment, because for me, it's actually like driving a car with your foot flat on the accelerator and the other one hard on the brake at the same time. So I hope that this vivid picture helps for you to see the nervous system in this situation. And it becomes all too clear to see how stored trauma, toxic stress, and deeply buried emotions such as rage can actually just blow a gasket or just break down your body. So when we talk about the body being in charge, this is exactly what it is that we mean. It's a series of spontaneous reactions that we seemingly have zero control over that has become the new normal. We trap toxic stress or trauma in our body, and it stays there unless we're able to heal it consciously and let go of the trapped trauma, and then reteach the body-mind complex to regulate appropriately and create a brand new familiar. So I wonder, after this little bit of information, are you actually seeing the link to trauma and these underlying diseases? They are the one and the same system. It gives us life and regulates and manages our various different bodily functions, but it shuts down and locks us into fight, flight, or freeze to protect us from danger. And when we don't let go, we stay there. So doesn't it make sense then that all the work that we should be doing starts with the nervous system? And also it makes sense that the bodily systems for which it controls could start to misfire and create physical illness in those very same places it controls. Naturally, the body systems that the autonomic nervous system runs are going to suffer. And in the long term, it's just going to create chronic illness. In our normal daily working lives, our system is going from activation to deactivation or non-activation, whichever you prefer, from dysregulation to regulation. And this has its own term called pendulation. In our lives, we all get activated. That is just a reality. I like to think of this as a growth period. Our emotions were given to us to allow full expression. Yes, it's true. We don't have to live our lives activating every single emotion on absolute full all of the time to the detriment of other people. But we were actually given these emotions to allow us to experience life to the full and to process life to the full. So as humans, we are naturally a bit messy at times. In all of our humanness, we are messy. And the key is to know what happened just before we were activated and what was the trigger that took us there. And there, when we get that, in that moment, there is absolute magic. The messiness gave us the information that we needed so that we could actually transform into a new personal reality. Getting activated simply is a natural behavior. But the key is, how long do we stay there? How do we choose to activate? Do we throw our toys out of the cot? Do we blame, or do we ask questions? How do we choose to deactivate through the choice of tools? And also, at what speed do we do it? Once you help the client on how to use the tools, they get to experience the wave of that activation as a spike, or actually a gentle wave. So how do we deactivate, or regulate? I would like you to think about it this way. You are on a tube train in London, as you can see from the slides here, but this is a big difference. This is your tube train. It actually belongs to you. And inside the train is your nervous system, and the outside is your body. So the inside is representative of what is actually happening inside your nervous system. If you've never been on a tube train before, it's okay. Just think about any kind of train with no windows. So when you leave the station now that you're on this train, there are just one or two people on it. And it's quite peaceful. Everything's just nice. And these people represent your everyday stresses. You stop at the next train station and a whole whack of people get on. And then at the next train station, even more people get on. And it's just started to get really, really tight, not so easy to breathe, getting a little bit hot, not a lot of space for movement. And then at the next station, even more people get on, and then you're going to be feeling that squeeze. And that's what's happening inside your nervous system when we take on more and more of that toxic stress and we just don't release it or deactivate it. Now imagine staying on that train just like that and living your life that way. And if this is how your nervous system is, anxiety, depression, chronic illness, well, it's just bound to happen. So what we need to do is to deactivate or deregulate. We need to get people off the train. So slowly, more and more people get off the train. It's a bit calmer. We now feel deactivated and we're back to baseline. It got a bit hot and messy for a minute, but the deregulation tools bring functioning back to the normal. And now we're in control of what comes on and what actually then goes off. If you wanted to, you could also use the same example with a swimming pool and lots of balls. The more and more balls that go into a swimming pool, eventually there's just no room. So to make room, you would actually need to take the balls out. So whichever example works for you is really fine. The last consideration in relation to the nervous system with trauma clients is that their baseline may be so close to the activation line. And this is because of their current trauma state or having lived in trauma for a really, really long time. And you're going to see how important that is later in terms of the different kind of protocols or modalities that get used. So instead of relaxation, there's just no space to live in the nervous system. And the baseline over time crept up so close to the activation level, there's this tiny little space to play with. So when we talk about putting space in the system, it's about filling up this area so that we can create much, much bigger gap between the baseline and activation. So that's obviously what we call space. So we now know through different studies that stuckness in the nervous system, which is our people on the train or the balls in the swimming pool, whichever way you like to look at it, it shows up in the health of our organs and systems. Also how quickly we bounce back from something like a simple cold. Also our ability to eliminate waste and digest our food, our creative potential and imagination. Is it impaired when our nervous system is activated or full? In our relationships and how we relate to others, how short our fuses, and by that I mean our temper, how quickly we move into overwhelm, and how we care for ourselves and for others. Are we over-focused on ourselves or over-focused on others, or just not focused on others at all, or not focused on ourselves? And also how we set boundaries. So this is just another list for you when you're talking to your clients or filling in a take-on form where you can start to listen to some of the components which they are being faced with. So in summary then, we have an autonomic nervous system, which is absolutely designed for the worst set of scenarios, which is brilliant. But we also have the higher brain that keeps us from letting go of past events. When we don't release, we stay stuck in our old familiar ways of responding and dealing with life. And this of course limits our wellness and good system regulation, which means good flow. So good flow means good up and down rhythm. To top it off, we have these toxic chemicals that are circulating, causing damage to the bodies. And the baseline gets closer and closer to activation, leaving little or no room between the activation and the baseline. And then in addition to that, if we get PTSD, our hormones just don't return to the baseline. So the more we teach our systems to regulate with ease, we can actually inoculate ourselves from traumatic stress, and we're able to bounce back and actually have natural immunity, which is why it's so important to teach little children that at the earliest age possible. When the nervous system regulation finally increases, we sleep restfully and restore, we feel secure in ourselves, and we have a sense of personal power. Okay, so next we're going to explore the brain. So take another big, deep breath before we start. And we're going to look at how the brain is impacted by trauma. So as you know, our brain is the greatest supercomputer on earth with our body. I like to put the two of those together, between the body and the brain, because you can't separate them. They are the supercomputer. A complex network of 100 billion neurons. So when a real computer gets a shock, it just blows up or burns out. But it certainly shuts down until it needs to be repaired or until we get it repaired. pretty much the same thing actually happens inside ourselves, inside our supercomputer. Our brilliant system encodes traumatic memories and pictures and body sensations that are split into tiny little fragments, and these are embedded in the mind like shrapnel or glass. The hippocampus, being the center of emotion and memory, has two jobs. The first is to shut down the stress response, and the second is to receive information and match it with the emotion and lay this down as memory or learning in the neocortex. So in trauma, the hippocampus shrinks. And then it ultimately impairs memory and also impairs learning. So a question to ask yourself is, do you know clients that are having memory problems? Perhaps you now know why. Something else to add to your list with your questions. The amygdala, being the center for creativity and imagination, it also helps us attune to our higher self, increases so it can actually better detect danger. So it becomes more easily activated, and it sends out the signal to our adrenals to release the stress hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline. And that then floods our system. So can you think of clients where they've got imagination issues, creativity, higher self-attunement? Perhaps now you know why. The prefrontal anterior cingulate function, being the center for planning and development, also decreases. So do you have client with planning and development issues? Perhaps this can also add to your questioning. As I said earlier, it's really like a virus. Our system is encoded anew, and the whole brain body is absolutely remapped with new ways of thinking, just like a virus on a computer. The question is, though, why do we continue to absolutely perpetuate that cycle? We think 60 to 70,000 thoughts in any one day. 90% of those thoughts are exactly the same thoughts as the day before. The same thoughts lead to the very same choices. The same choices lead to the very same behaviors, the same experiences, and the same emotions. And it's these very same feelings that drive exactly the same thoughts, and so the cycle begins again. The client's biology, neurocircuitry, neurobiology, hormones, and genetic expression will always be equal to how they think, act, and feel. So your personality absolutely creates your personal reality, what's happening in your life. So your personality is made up of how you think, feel, and act. We create our present personal reality, which is what we call our life. If we want to change a new personal reality, we have to think about what we've actually been thinking about so that we can raise it to our conscious awareness and then change it. So what does that mean? It means noticing the unconscious habits and behaviors that lead to the very, very same experiences, that create the very, very same feelings and identity, and what makes the actions and choices exactly the same. Along with that, we need to look and examine the emotions that have been memorized over a really, really long period of time, that have become part of the personality. And then we have to decide if we're going to continue with this way of responding and bring it actually into the future, or do we stay parked? So many people stay parked in that one place. Most people try and create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it's just impossible. Thinking the same way leads to the same behaviors, and there's just no change. Neuroscience tells us that nerve cells that fire together wire together. So as you keep choosing the same ways, the brain fires in exactly the same combinations in the same way every day. So we produce then the same every day, and this gets our brain into this very finite little signature, and this becomes the box of our brain. So helping the client think outside of a box then is really what you're doing. You're getting the brain to fire and work differently. The mind then is actually the brain in action. So our brain leads us down a garden path, and it does that all the time, not because it's working against us, but because we have such an amazing superpower computer who actually can be convinced of anything if only we just tell it. So if I said to you right now, imagine eating salt and vinegar crisps, you would start to feel that taste in your mouth right now. So this is how our system works. Right there, a chemical reaction to an imaginary picture, and it's also one of the keys to how we change it. But why does this go on so long? Why do people stay in places which are detrimental to them or make progress and then just fall off the wagon? In the 1970s, Richard Solomon of the University of Pennsylvania said the body learns to adjust to all kinds of stimuli. We might get hooked onto recreational drugs and alcohol because they make us feel good, and that takes us into a place of numbing something out. But also activities like marathon running, parachute jumping, weight training, car racing as examples, which initially actually cause discomfort and sometimes terror. We can actually ultimately teach ourselves that these activities are enjoyable, and the body starts to crave them. Danger and trauma are exactly the same. Why do people go back again and again to these terrible situations? Freud believed that we actually repeat it again and again to get some kind of semblance of control over a situation. Maybe this part is in some way true, but we go back because it feels familiar. The body and the brain is used to this very same situation. It initially was super terrifying, like jumping out of a plane, but the more we do it, the more familiar it becomes. And somehow then, fear and aversion move into the zone of pleasure in the body. And again, here's the kicker, unknowingly to the client. So what's also important is that trauma clients often can't feel the difference between excitement and danger. And this needs to be taught. So something that is good and exciting may feel completely dangerous, and that is super confusing. Another example is confusion over love. For instance, the caregiver loves me, but they hurt me. So what is love? Surely then love is allowing others to harm you and you actually putting up with it. So what are the 5 telltale signs of trauma? So first of all, it might show up in super healthy but unwell clients. So they might have things like digestive troubles, chronic health issues, they can't lose body fat, metabolism might be super slow, their body isn't getting enough oxygen to the cells, and the threat mechanism inside is saying, danger, store up energy, keep that fat. The nervous system just wants to hide and hibernate. The person could be very frustrated, they have a lot of stored up survival stress, they could be in freeze mode and shut down. It may also show up in a form of resistance or perhaps procrastination. They're just not getting things done. So with this kind of group though, you can do behavior change strategies quite quickly and set up routines and have really good outsmarting habits, but it really is an effort and actually a really big struggle. But they are short-term strategies that can be used to micromanage that resistance. When the trauma's gone though, there doesn't have to be those reward tactics set up. There could also be a lack of drive to move forward. So inside themselves, they're living in a freeze portion, or it could be one part of their system. It shows up as anxiety and fear for no apparent reason. Panic attacks, negative thoughts under the realm of anxiety and fear. They could have all the positive thinking in the world, but they're still looking for the threat on the outside. There's tightness in the throat, butterflies in the body, heart is jittery and anxious. There's all this overwhelming body sensation going on. They're feeling that the world is coming to an end. Feels like they're having a heart attack maybe, and they're trying to express and release deep impulses, but it all feels like anxiety and fear. It might also show up as toxic relationships and self-sabotage. And those people are always in toxic relationships and risky situations. They have a lack of accurate gut instinct. They make decisions really fast. They don't set clear boundaries or stick to them. They're very much into people pleasing or something similar to that. They have a lack of accurate perception of dangerous and safe environments. They can't judge what is and isn't safe. They struggle to be a reliable witness for themselves to actually see what it is that they're doing. They try to set healthy boundaries and good boundaries, but they're always getting tripped up. The chances are there is misattunement from the early caregivers. There is an inability to push ahead with career and self-expression. It might also show up as chronic health conditions of the physical and mental kind, and that might be things like IBS, autoimmune problems, migraine headaches, insomnia, lacking in energy, the body struggling to regulate and repair. They may have been to merry-go-rounds of healthcare providers or specialists. They've had every diet known to man, they've cleansed, they've taken plant-based medicines, but they are riddled with symptoms. And they've seen plenty of non-trauma doctors that could be telling them that it's in their head. And it's the survival stress physiology that's causing the nervous system dysregulation. So now we turn our attention to early development trauma. So take another big breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and just another one. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Okay, so we're going to look at early development trauma. So this is defined as trauma that happens during the stages of the child's growth. And it's called, as you heard earlier on, adverse childhood experiences. It's the ACEs. An adverse childhood experience is a traumatic experience that occurred before the age of 18, ranging from abuse and neglect to living with an adult with a mental illness or something like a nervous breakdown, maybe bulimia, etc., or a less than optimal caregiver. This includes being insulted, humiliated, sworn at, put down by a parent, and as the number of ACEs increase, so does the risk for the many, many physical and mental health and social issues that we talked about earlier on, as well as alcoholism, chronic depression, drug use, heart disease, sexual violence, suicide attempts. Childhood adversity can change a child's biology, and it has a lifetime of consequences. And of course, the longer the trauma continues, the longer it does actually take to heal. Without intervention, people that are on the ACE score of 6 or more die an average of 20 years earlier. And that for me is just so heartbreaking. The earlier the trauma happens, the less time the person has, in this case, let's say the child, to build a stable, solid self-identification and understanding so they can learn the basic skills of, let's say, healthy life, healthy love, healthy relationships as an example. So the child has nothing to go back to build on or from. So for instance, if the child had no record of building positive, loving, caring relationships, they're likely without treatment not even able to recognize what a loving, stable relationship is. And then they keep repeating that same old trauma cycle of how their parents behaved or instituting what they've seen from others. It's why development trauma with children is just way more invasive. As an adult, there was a self. So before the trauma, there was a self. And then you can help them rebuild from that self before the trauma and improve on that. But children simply don't have that building block, which is why later in life, the adult has to have a lot more work to do. I would like you to consider what was developing at the time of trauma when issues show up to help further your investigations and your questions and your treatment. So between ages 0 to 1, basic trust and mistrust, which bring in the safety issues. 1 to 3, autonomy versus shame, doubt and abandonment. 3 to 6, initiative versus guilt and self-doubt. 6 to 12, competence versus inferiority and independence. And 12 to 19, identity versus confusion. It's also important to know the effects of trauma in 0 to 5 years can show up in both children and adults as sleeping disturbances, eating problems, regressive behaviors, poor impulse control. They could be a bit clingy, withdrawal, fearful of being alone, easily startled, general mistrust of others. So if clients show up with any of these issues and you haven't actually addressed trauma, again, this is a time to stop, look at these lists and start to consider whether trauma is something for you to look at. We're going to take a look at the child's general order of development. So it's really important to understand this order because whenever the trauma happened, your client at whatever age that they may have been hurt, they've actually stopped whatever process was going on at that time. So they've stopped developing at that process at that time. And then it caused issues in everything else that followed. So for an example, an issue in the first stage, which is actually the sensory stage, every single stage thereafter has got some kind of corruption. But if it's in the cognition stage, a little bit closer to the end when the trauma happens, the first 5 will remain relatively untouched and unscathed. So understanding this is really critical for the client's recovery. Should something come up in a repatterning session that shows up as the client, let's say, being clingy, and the client is actually far from clingy as an adult, you'd be able to recognize, for instance, attachment. And attachment means the only way the child could survive was to attach to the parent, even though the parent was actually the dangerous one. So being able to interpret this meaning for the client so it really does land in the right way and not the wrong way for a trauma client is really important. So you can do this together once you've actually educated the client and you can work through their recovery. So we know from the RR teachings how birth stress impacts our lives. So we're not going to touch on this today, although I will say that in utero stress brings very high levels of cortisol across the placenta and absolutely fundamentally alters the child's response to stress overall when they're born. So they will be born with a nervous system that is set on high in order to deal with the hostile world. So because these are so critical, what I have done is included all this information that you're seeing here on these 2 slides in an attachment. So unfortunately, we don't have time today to go into the detail, but please go through the attachment and see the detail, because you will actually be able to see the behavior in your clients and start to be able to figure out actually where it was that they got caught up and tripped up. So there's development trauma in the sensory stage, in the attachment stage, in the emotional regulation stage, in the behavior regulation stage, which is called the window of tolerance, the disassociation stage, the trauma cognition stage, and the trauma self-concept and identity development, sorry. So those are each one of the areas. And again, please go through the handout and you will be able to get the detail of each one of these areas. So let's look at what some of the triggers and signs of development trauma the triggers and signs of development trauma are. So there are many feelings or environmental cues that can activate someone who's actually experienced development trauma. So power control can be really big issues. Others include unexpected change, lack of information, feeling threatened or attacked, feeling vulnerable or frightened, and feeling toxic shame. So in terms of the signs, they can be easily activated. They're very quickly out of their resiliency zone. They get agitated. There's tightness in the chest, sweating, clenching teeth, wringing hands, bouncing legs, shaking, crying, giggling, pacing, breathing hard, shortness of breath, loud voice, swearing, restlessness. So if you see 3 or more of these grouped together, they may be development trauma, so important to investigate. On their own, not necessarily. Okay, so take another big deep breath. In through your nose, out through your mouth, as we go through the next pass. One more big breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Okay, well done. All right, so now we're going to look at a quick nugget on intergenerational trauma. So on top of this development trauma, intergenerational trauma is passed down from generation to generation in families or communities. So examples are survivors of catastrophic natural disasters, trafficking, imprisonment, domestic violence, physical, emotional and sexual abuse, slavery, colonization, forced displacement, Holocaust and genocide survivors, and of course, lots of different kinds of diseases. So epigenetics recent studies actually show that trauma alters the gene expression and that these adaptations are passed on to our children. We can, of course, change our genes. That's the really important thing to remember. So science has proven 3 generations, but they also have evidence that this is true for 6 to 7 generations as well. An experiment was completed with a group of rodents. I don't agree with this, but it's important to tell you. They sprayed them with rose water and then they were shocked somehow. And then 3 generations later, all they had to do was to spray the rose water into the air. And the children, 3 generations later, immediately went into shock. Remember, that was just rose water in the air. So please don't discount trauma in terms of the intergenerationals, because even when the person doesn't understand or know that they've had trauma in their lifetime, they could be bringing in that intergenerational trauma in this lifetime. So please don't discount that. I also want to add here that using something like a Louise Hay book, who I love, is really fantastic to help understand illnesses. But really be sure before you do that, that you're communicating the right information. Is this illness related to a toxic nervous system? And that's why it's been generated. Or is this intergenerational trauma that has been superimposed on the person. And simply them reading out what this means is a traumatizing issue all on its own and must be accurate. So it needs more investigation. Okay, so in terms of this slide, other things to consider. We won't get time to be able to do this today, but I wanted to bring it up on the screen, and I have included this in the handout for you as well. Okay, so we're going to bounce now to trauma care and why this is important. So what you're doing is important as the practitioner or therapist, and we are there in the middle and we're there at the end, and sometimes that can be harder than the first responder. We really want to help, but not at our own expense. So the tools that you can use for yourself and build your own capacity are the same selection that you can actually use for your client, and you can muscle check which ones you need. Taking good care of yourself shows them that this is really, really important consistently, and that's one of the ways that you can teach. Our objective as a therapist in the first instance with all trauma patients is to stabilize the nervous system, and restore safety as quickly as possible. So let's talk about safety for a moment. So you may already be doing this, but I just want to cover this with you quickly. Sorry. Okay, so operating from a place of safety and choice is absolutely critical. So when going through trauma, their safety was obviously taken away from them at that moment in time. They just lost their voice and their ability to be able to choose or get away, and they couldn't defend themselves. So creating an environment to create safety and choice is really important. So share that you're working together as a team, empowering them to make the changes that helps make their self-protection responses available again. And this allows them to move forward physically and emotionally and psychologically. What's also important is being trustworthy and predictable. So always make sure that the things that you say you're going to do, you actually physically do. So whether that's sending an email, booking an appointment, doing a follow-up, all of these things will establish trust. So do as much as possible in advance so that they know what to expect, so that you are predictable and reliable. Otherwise, their nervous system pays attention to the difference that they're receiving, and they notice and hear unpredictability and tune out of what you're saying. As we're in partnership, their system is paying attention to your system all of the time. And you heard that as we started. So remember what we said in the beginning, that the nervous system is waking up and it's co-regulating with your caregiver. So it's co-regulating with you in this particular instance. So if there's anything that may show up in a way that might throw the client off, like you might be in menopause as an example and having hot flushes, it's really important that you tell them that up front. It doesn't matter whether it's online, via Zoom or face-to-face. Our systems are geared to be hunting and looking for things that they don't understand, that may not be explained. And when they're not explained, they're out of alignment. Therefore, it falls into the category of danger. So the best thing you can do for yourself and your clients is to be honest about what's happening with you and your nervous system. In addition, you need to stay focused on the client for the whole time. So switch the phones off, absolutely no disruptions. If your client picks it up, and if they don't know what's going on, they will make up a story in their brain and their nervous system will take over, and it will actually just take them out of the conversation, session over. And everything thereafter, of course, when I say session over, is then pointless. In addition to that, if you have a people pleaser, remember the fawning response, they will just agree that it's all okay when actually it's not. Okay, so we're going to touch on the pre-education and assessments piece later. So let's now look at some keys for self-care for the practitioner or therapist, and then we'll look at the client. So maybe much of this you actually know from RR. So let's start with pre-session. So what's important with trauma patients is that you really do need to check in for yourself. What do you actually need the day before? What do you need an hour before, like eating, drinking water? What actually makes you feel good? Do a capacity check. How much capacity does your nervous system have today? Do you need a tool now? How long will you be able to let this session go on for? What is it that you actually can do today? Make sure that you've done all your prep so you have enough information to be able to cope with triggers. During the session, do a capacity check and an activation check. How much more room do you have to continue with the session today? How long can this go on for? Remember that The systems are co-regulating, as I mentioned, all the time. So the strongest one will always lead. So it's up to you to notice and correct that. So at some point, it may happen that it might be you have to say, look, I've noticed an activation in my system and I'm going to take a minute just to get settled. If you actually make it part of the conversation, then you make it okay and you normalize it. You can show the client that it's really normal and easy to handle, but you must take that moment to de-escalate, because your system triggers the client's system because you are co-regulating and you lose capacity. So just take a moment to pause. If the nervous system doesn't calm down, the brain makes up a story, remember, and creates the chemical reaction, just like the example I gave you regarding the salt and vinegar in the body. After the session, do another capacity check, another activation check, do a system check, do something for balance and nourishment, and reach out for support. On an ongoing basis, it's very likely that your traumatized client has absolutely zero idea what personal boundaries are. So you need to be clear and set them and show up so that they naturally know your boundaries, like opening, closing, availability. And by doing that, they can also learn from you. And then also remember to leave enough time between the sessions so that, excuse me, you can do a cursory review of the steps at least. Okay. So take another big deep breath. And we're going to move now into client care and trauma recovery. So this information here is really critical. In the early ages, we experienced the world via our somatic body self. So those who endured early trauma find it really difficult to heal with thought, behavior, mindfulness, and some other practices to begin with. So an example, EMDR and tapping can, with some people, have adverse reactions. Again, with some people, diets and supplements can make it worse. Movement, manipulation of tissue, yoga, massage, some meditations and acupuncture are just examples that can be just too much, because what they do is they overstimulate an already activated system, because the regulation needs to be supported first. And actually, I find that this has been the biggest mistake of sufferers trying to get well. They go to too many alternative therapists, they try and do everything at the same time, and they can't work out why it's not working. Their brain then tells them a story, and then before you know it, they've dumped everything and they go on to the next barrage of therapists. So it's really, really important to have the plan that's worked out and to be checking what is the right place to start with the clients. So I remember in my journey, I kept being told, you won't change anything if you don't change your thinking and meditate. And I was already doing both of those, but unsuccessfully. I also remember doing a meditation for a man that I hugely admire. And after 2 days, each time I did it, I felt so unwell and off balance, but I thought, yes, I'll just push through. But actually, it made it worse, much, much worse, because of overactivating an already active nervous system where the baseline and activation was like this. So understanding this and knowing that many are already in this high state of activation, adding to that activation and helping your clients understand the concept of too much and also the concept of sequence and doing it in the right order is key. So the sequence focuses on restoring the nervous system regulation and building this through education and building new neural pathways. When all of this is combined, you get a way more powerful and more profound system at a much, much deeper level. So trauma recovery is recovering the entire life of the person. That's what you're doing, to a brand new state of being, both personally and professionally. You're taking them from dysregulation to regulation, a completion of cycles that weren't able to be completed before. The correction of mistaken beliefs, healing from grief, shame and sorrow, and changing beliefs about themselves that were incorrect and no longer serve. So having all of the various parts then working together. So the goal then is to enable the client system to make a gradual shift from unpredictable danger to reliable safety. So safety is the primary focus for the practitioner in the first case. And then we focus on building resiliency, capacity, and tolerance. And we do this by reducing the intensity, frequency, and duration of traumatic effects by expanding the tolerance and increasing resilience. to enable discernment between the outside danger and the inside danger, to create space in the nervous system, to rejoin the brain and body to feel safe in the body, to improve perception of dangerous and safe environments so that they can know what to choose, to help them learn the areas where there are gaps. For instance, we've talked about some of these today: healthy relationships, boundaries. And when you do that, you help to rebuild the overall whole person, to help change perspective, to help build a new reality and purpose, make space to be curious and explore so that they can be themselves, their authentic selves, and be good about showing up in the strength of who they are. And they can be more natural and more spontaneous. So how do we help? So the first thing is the take-on form, and this is really, really important. So in one of the handouts, I've included questions and ideas for a take-on form, and you can expand on that. They are not the only ones, but they start with giving you information to really get you going. So you can start to become the Sherlock Holmes that we talked about in the beginning for a moment. Once you have the information on the form, you'll be able to see toxic stress, you'll be able to see the trauma, you'll be able to see what kinds of trauma and what this means. You'll be able to see how this is showing up in their lives and be able to map it back to the list, some of the lists we've seen today and lists that I've put onto the workbook for you. So you'll be able to see the trauma and the ages so that you can start to actually match it all together and see what's going on and formulate the right questions to ask in the first session. You might even be able to start looking at what that treatment plan might look like so that you can start envisaging the kind of team that you will need to talk to and put together to really work on giving that treatment plan to the client that you have. And then also what kind of assessments that you might want to do. So let's look at assessments. There are many assessments that you can do. You can see here some examples on the slide. You could choose to get a real handle of their learning style as an example, so you know how best to coach them through the learning process and the ACE test and so on. It's really up to you what kind of assessments you want to use and what kind of practice that you want to build. But it's really worth researching and working out what will work for you and what will work for how you want to go forward in your practice. The next big area is education, and this is the key. The more information and education we do is critical. We are tapping into the higher brain cleverness, cultivating self-awareness and curiosity, although it must be put across in a very easy to understand way. Mostly your client has no idea what's actually happening to them. So by helping them understand how the system works and then helping them understand where they are and what is actually happening to them and where they are in the world is really important. It starts to help the nervous system understand and is the first step to feeling safe. So when we understand, we feel it less and we let it move through our train or our swimming pool, whichever visual example works for you, as I mentioned, and we empty the stress and we can start the process of deregulation and downgrading fear. Curiosity is the key as well, asking questions, getting the system diverted. It is absolutely flat out impossible for the brain to stay in activation and in curiosity at the same time. So help them understand the gift of curiosity, the gift of asking questions, as it brings the activation down quite quickly. So we're taking them through a learning journey of being unconsciously unskilled when they come along around this issue, taking them to consciously unskilled, consciously skilled, and then unconsciously skilled, which is all about then kind of habit. Through the law of repetition, we repeat the thought, action, feeling, and the skill, and then we do it over and over again. We do it over and over again until it becomes easy, familiar, natural, automatic, effortless, and second nature. Think about putting together a series of short videos so that your client can understand prior to your sessions what is actually happening, so that they obviously can't get everything in one go. So work out exactly what it is that you need in your practice and help them along that healing journey. You can carry on your learning with those videos through the recovery, depending again on what kind of practice you want to have. Then we look at support and community. It's why Alcoholics Anonymous really works. Connection and community are critical. You may have a community of your clients or a community of trauma survivors, or perhaps the client has a community of coherent persons that can provide support, or there are other online communities in your area or face-to-face groups that can provide this actual support. But research your area. I must add that I've often found that even when the client says there are coherent groups, they don't really know what those coherent groups are. So often they make the wrong choices. So a really nice story was included in Malcolm Gladwell's book called Outliers. He talks about a group of men in the 1950s who immigrated from Italy, and they were dying of old age, no heart disease. They had a super unhealthy lifestyle. They drank a lot, they were overweight, they didn't exercise, and it just confused the medical community. Further down the road, there was another group of people with similar ages, but they were dying with complications such as heart disease. So what did they actually find? They found that the group of men from Italy had a small community with 22 civic organizations, a powerful protective social structure insulating them from the pressures of the modern world. Our nervous system wants to reconnect with others, to down-regulate and self-regulate. We are social creatures wired for human connection, and trauma sufferers more than most need a community. Not to rehash what happened, and this is really important, but to be supported and build a good sense of connection. And just remember what I said then about the friends around the trauma sufferers, is that quite often, if we want to get them to go out and push them to go out and enjoy the friendship company, we could be pushing them to go out and enjoy friendship company with the wrong people. So anyway, encourage them, if they feel safe enough over time, to explain to close friends, but again, make sure that you validate those close friends, what trauma they have and how this shows up, so that the friends can actually understand. It does build a great deal more depth in the relationship. I'm reminded of an experience of a friend of mine relayed to me recently, where a child in a shopping center had lost her temper and was crying uncontrollably. And instead of yelling at the child or leaving her standing in the middle of the aisles and walking away, he bent down and just held her until the crying stopped. That's a really, really in tune caregiver. A similar thing happened recently with a friend of mine who lost her temper after facing a considerable stress, and her reaction was to walk away in anger, but instead I stopped her, and once she calmed down, she was really thankful. You just need to have the right friends around where they can be mutually understanding of your stress and the trauma, and actually it can work both ways. Okay, the next area is about mastering stress physiology. So learning what signs of stress are in the body. And then de-escalating it and releasing it are absolutely critical. So one of the things that we're doing is coaxing the nervous system into recovery using a range of tools and neurosensory exercises. Building capacity, resilience, and tolerance are about making the train or the swimming pool bigger. That's what we're doing. We're expanding the train and the pool. And we can integrate and let it go then in seconds. We know this because through resonance repatterning, we have an abundance of tools in the Spiral Up book that can help release stuck energy. Learning how to identify the range of natural emotions and learning what it is and what it feels like and how to release it. And building capacity happens in two ways: working with the cells and organs and working with the other bodily systems. I've included in a handout with 2 pages, with 2 pages of ideas to help go from dysregulation to regulation, and to help train the body to get used to the fact that being uncomfortable doesn't always equal bad. But here is a couple of examples. Excuse me. Okay, so the first thing that we are doing is training the body from discomfort to comfort. So how do we do that? Step 1, every day do something that's uncomfortable, that's not something to hurt or leave the client in pain. An example would be having a warm shower and then turning the shower to cold for a few seconds and then back to warm, and then back to cold and then back to warm. The critical part of this cycle is that you must return to comfort. You start with comfort, not discomfort, and return to comfort. And whilst that's happening, pay attention to the body at every single stage of the cycle, noticing what thoughts are entering the brain, noticing any responses from the body, and afterwards at every point record this in a journal to track and review. This will help the body mind to understand that discomfort doesn't have to be bad. You could also do the same thing from hot and cold weather as an example, or hot and cold drinks. The second example is about asking questions, bringing in curiosity and staying curious to downgrade fear. And for me, curiosity is king. I want you to reflect back for a minute about the stressor that you might have thought about at the beginning. And if you have got a stressor that you have in mind, let's just use that as an example as we go through the process. If you haven't got a stressor that popped to mind, don't worry about it. Okay, so step one is ask questions. So if you have got a stressor, let it pop up and notice what's happening inside your body right now. And then think back to the last time that you were stressed about that situation and ask what was happening in that moment. Then ask yourself what happened just before the stressor started. Then ask yourself what was the trigger that started it. Then we want to move on to feeling. What was the emotion that you felt? If you can't feel the emotion, what is it that you were inspired to do at that moment in time, like hit something, and that will give you a bit of an idea. Now just use a thymus tap to release the energy for now, but you can use many things. The point is that any question in the moment actually works and will downgrade fear. Curiosity is king. You cannot be activated and be asking questions at the same time. It's impossible. So the moment your client learns if there's an element of fear rising, one of the big things is to move into curiosity and be asking questions, any questions really. But I want to give you another example, because on Grey's Anatomy recently, if you watch that, a doctor was suffering with anxiety and she started to spiral up into fear and overwhelm. And she'd learned a technique, which is to repeat a process that you know over and over again, over and over again. It's also the questions. So for instance, let's say the process was changing a nappy. If you actually said what each one of those things were over and over again, what you're doing is allowing curiosity to come in, and actually it de-escalates the fear really, really quickly. Okay, then we move to neuroplasticity. This is our brain's ability to change its synaptic wiring by learning information and recording experiences. It allows us to evolve our actions and modify our behavior so that we can do a better job. So it simply is about strengthening new neural pathways in the brain. Neurons that fire together, wire together, and they build bigger networks, just like we do as humans. We create communities and groups to support us, support our brains. This is exactly the same. So building new ways of thinking and new connections attached to a strong emotion starts to load up brand new software, and it upgrades the mind body. Build more pathways first before you start taking out. That's really, really important. So again, I'm going to repeat that. Build more pathways first before you start taking out. The next step is energy clearing. Often clients that have been traumatized have a lot of stuck energy, which is added to the symptoms. So perhaps you can team up with an additional energy clearer that might help you shift some of that. Then we move into purpose, identifying purpose and meaning. We are meaning-making machines. So working with the meaning behind the events, the purpose of life going forward, and helping to create a new personal reality is really, really important. And then lastly, to personal commitment. When a person has experienced trauma, they have no choice, no voice, and no impact. So in order to help them move from victim to survivor, it's really helpful to ease them into their owning of their own voice, owning their own choices and the impact, by asking them to take some concrete action steps and making that personal commitment so that they can get the most out of their work and sessions. Getting them involved this way also helps to re-engage their self-protective mechanisms, which in the most cases have been turned off. Remember the client's voice every step of the way. It repairs several aspects at the same time: voice, choice, permission, boundaries, and helps them to reset their self-protective mechanisms. So in closing, when we know what's going on and we have support, we learn to master as opposed to fearing it. We have tools that allow us to move forward and a purpose that compels us. And when applied in absolutely the right sequence, which you can also muscle check, we allow it to move through us, and this contributes to building capacity. It creates a much bigger train or swimming pool. The passengers or balls might come in, but they don't stay there for very long. And then before you know it, we have a big handle on the situation. We have a handle on the big, and we have a handle on the little stressors. So if one person takes this information and helps another, in that we touch more people than we did yesterday in knowing and healing trauma, we have broadened the understanding and uplifted our compassion to touch and support each other in this growing community. If they are lucky to find the knowledge through a trauma-informed practitioner or their own education, they can discover that they are indeed the most beautiful souls, that they have endured so much and they no longer have to tolerate anymore, that they are gifted in learning and having learned more compassion. They've overcome tremendous adversity with such courage and determination, and that they have a right to a beautiful life. They have a right to a voice to speak out and live an abundant life. And even when others have a lack of understanding, there is a path. There is a path, and it can be joyous and it can be liberating, and it is one to absolute freedom. They can bounce into a new future, a new way of being, and they can create a new personal reality through trauma education and applying the right sequencing. We can be a gift to the world and help others understand and bounce. Thank you very much for listening today. It really has been a pleasure to do this with you.